on page 22, at paragraph 187, in the first bullet point, the same amendment is to be made. In other words, the first 2 lines and 3 words are to be deleted and replaced with the words, clients are asked to claim on Medicare for psychiatric and medical costs which are related to the abuse. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And at page 33, paragraph 265, in the middle of the 5th line, from the words, the only time that clients are asked to claim on Medicare is regarding psychiatric costs, is to be deleted and replaced with the words, clients are asked to claim on Medicare for psychiatric and medical costs which are related to the abuse. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Are there any other amendments you wish to make to the statement?
No, Mr. Stewart.
With those amendments, do you confirm that it is true and correct? Do you confirm the statement is true and correct?
Yes.
I tender the statement, Your Honour.
It'll be Exhibit 16-17.
Now, Ms. Sharkey, I understand that you hold a Bachelor of Arts degree and a graduate diploma in education and a graduate diploma in applied social psychology and a Master in Arts psychoanalytic studies. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you've studied relationship counselling at Relationships Australia and art therapy and child psychology through psychology professional development requirements. Is that right?
That's correct.
And in 1991, you completed the Supervisor for Psychologists program at the Catholic Family Welfare Bureau. Is that right?
That's correct.
You are a registered psychologist, are you?
I am.
And you're also a qualified secondary school teacher and have worked extensively in both private practice and organizational consulting. Is that right?
That's right.
And you've worked in secondary education and administration at various schools?
Yes.
In 1991, you commenced in the role of coordinator of the Catholic Family Welfare Bureau in Dandenong, did you?
Yes.
And your role there was general management and coordination.
That's right.
Between 1996 and 2001, you were employed by the Archdiocese of Melbourne as the coordinator of Carelink.
Yes.
And then in 2001, you left Carelink and then returned again to that same role in 2003. Is that right?
Yeah, 3, 4, yes.
And you've remained in that role since then?
I have.
Yes. Thank you. Now, Ms. Sharkey, one of the central aspects to the model that Carelink has adopted is, as I understand it, that Carelink itself provides administration, assessment, guidance, and financing, but treatment itself is provided by external health service providers. Is that right?
Yes.
Are you able to provide some insight as to why that model was chosen as opposed to a model where Carelink would itself provide treatment and counselling?
Several reasons for that. One is that people who come through Carelink need to be referred to specialists in the area of their need, and it was never going to be Carelink's role to do any in-house counselling at all.
And having worked in Carelink for many years, do you have any reflections on whether that model that Carelink has adopted is the most appropriate one or the most effective?
I think it is the most effective, given that the seriousness and the difference between the clients that come forward to Carelink means that their treatment needs to be sought by the best professionals that we can find. Of the 350-odd people that have come to Carelink as primary victims, and the stories that I've heard, none of them have been the same, and their needs have all been different.
I suppose a different model might have an external health service provider chosen by the particular client of Carelink develop and provide overall guidance or treatment plan, whereas the Carelink model provides that overall guidance and treatment plan internally through you and the consulting psychiatrist. Do you have any comment on that as a possible different way of dealing with things?
Can I just clarify that you're saying to me that if the person comes to Carelink with a treater, that is a better way to go?
I'm not suggesting any way is better. I'm just asking you what your thoughts are on other ways of potentially providing the service to what you describe as clients.
I think it would be very difficult for an organisation like Carelink to have on their staff the range of professionals necessary for the range of different cases that have come to us.
Would one of the reasons for you and the consulting psychiatrist doing an assessment in each case and reviewing that from time to time to be to ensure that what's being provided to the client is within Carelink's terms of reference?
Yes.
And is related, and I'll come back to the degree of relatedness, but is related or arising from the abuse that they've suffered.
Yes.
Could we have a look at paragraph 21 of your statement, which is on page 3? You say there that you first became...
Sorry, there's nothing coming up on my screen.
I'm sure that that can be fixed by someone.
Sorry, could you repeat the number again?
Whichever is more convenient to you, Ms. Sharkey, you're welcome to refer to the hard copy or to what's on your screen. I understand now it is on your screen.
Oh, it's here now.
Yes, but whichever is more convenient to you.
It's probably easier here.
Yes. So you'll see paragraph 21, you say you first became aware that there was a particular issue regarding historical sexual abuse in the Catholic Church when it was written about in the newspapers in the late 1980s, in particular overseas publications relating to Ireland and America. Now, excuse me, you've used the terminology there, historical sexual abuse. I take it you not meaning to say that there wasn't abuse happening at that time. In other words, at the time you became aware.
I would assume that there was, whilst most of the abuse that was being dealt with was historical, but I wouldn't in any way suggest that it wasn't still occurring.
It was historical in the sense that typically it takes some time for people to disclose their abuse.
Yes.
And if you can take a look at paragraph 26 of your statement. You say there that Carelink is funded by the Archdiocese of Melbourne, but like independent commissioners and the compensation panel, it operates independently of the Archbishop and the Archdiocese. Now, it strikes me that there's certain respects in which that independence is qualified, and I'm going to identify them and see whether you agree in a moment. I just want to put you at ease that in saying this, I don't mean to be critical. I'm just trying to understand what the facts are. One of the ways in which that independence is qualified, it seems to me, is that the Archdiocese of Melbourne sets the terms on which Carelink can offer support. Would that be right?
The boundaries for Carelink were set up initially by the Archdiocese.
Yes. And have those been reviewed from time to time?
Constantly being reviewed by the Archdiocese, supported by my supervisor, who's a medical psychiatrist, or psychiatrist medico, and also within the framework of how we operate, we're continually reviewing things, hoping to improve things.
Right. And another aspect in which it seems to me that independence is qualified is that ultimately it's the Archdiocese or the Archdiocese's, well, I withdraw that. Ultimately it's the Archdiocese or the Archdiocese on the advice of its solicitors that decides whether a particular claim for support is within or outside the terms on which Carelink offers support.
Carelink has very clear boundaries around how it operates, and if we need to go, we get a request that means we need to go outside those boundaries, I would go first to the lawyers and then be directed to the Archdiocese if that was the appropriate way to go.
And if you are satisfied that a particular request for support is both necessary and within Carelink's terms, then you would decide that that support would be offered. Is that right?
I would do that if it related to areas that I had some expertise in. If it related to issues where there were medical questions, I would speak with my supervisor, and she would come back to me with information relevant to the case.
Now, clearly you as coordinator are appointed by the Archdiocese, is that right?
That's correct.
And the consulting psychiatrist, currently Dr. Susan Brand, she's also, I take it, appointed by the Archdiocese.
That's correct.
And you also have a supervisor, and I'll come to supervision in a moment. That's Dr. Hacker, is that right?
That's correct.
And is Dr. Hacker also appointed by the Archdiocese, or is Dr. Hacker appointed by or chosen by you?
She's funded by the Archdiocese, but she was recommended by the line of psychiatrists that were originally at Carelink as being an expert in the area of the treatment of trauma.
And whose decision was it that she would be the one to be appointed as opposed to someone else?
Well, part of that would be my choice, because it's essential that anybody working in a position such as mine have someone that they can work with and have a good relationship with them.
Now, there are other staff members employed by Carelink. Perhaps you could just explain briefly what roles they fulfill.
We have one full-time secretary, one part-time secretary, so a combination of 8 days, secretarial assistance. Currently we have someone transcribing, and apart from Susan Brand, who does the assessments, and myself, and Dr. Hacker.
Well, excluding Drs. Hacker and Brand, the other staff members, I take it that you're responsible for appointing them, are you?
That would be done in assistance with the Human Resources Department of the Archdiocese.
I see. And when you have a need for legal advice, as I understand it, you, and that would be, by that I mean Carelink, would take advice from Cause Chambers Westgarth, the Archdiocese's solicitors, is that right?
That's right.
Now, when media issues arise, as sometimes they do, is the position that Carelink deals with the media directly, or is that to be dealt with by the Archdiocese?
That's dealt with by the Archdiocese. We don't have anything to do with the media.
And why is that? Do you
Yes,
know that?
yes, because we have issues of confidentiality at Carelink, and it would be inappropriate for us to be speaking to the media.
Well, I understand that obviously in relation to matters that are confidential, but with regard to inquiries as to how Carelink operates or particular controversies that have arisen that might give rise to an answer which doesn't disclose confidential matters, is there a reason why Carelink doesn't or cannot deal with those themselves?
Well, we haven't in the past, and there's a media section of the Archdiocese that would first of all advise us.
Could I ask that we have a look at tab 4? You'll see this is the original appointment for Professor Ball as consultant psychiatrist back in October 1996. If we can look at the last paragraph on that page, under the heading Professional Support, it said, and this is by then Monsignor Hart as Vicar General, he says to Professor Ball, this will be provided through a dedicated unit established under the aegis of the Catholic Family Welfare Bureau, and it says without being publicly identified with the Bureau. Now, I know this isn't your letter, and neither was it written to you, but do you understand why it is that Carelink was conceived of at that time as being established under the Catholic Family Welfare Bureau, but without being publicly identified with it?
No, I don't know why it started that way, but it was within a very short period of time that Carelink was separated completely from the Bureau.
Yes. Well, completely, but subject to the matters we've already dealt with regard to independence.
Well, it was totally independent of Catholic Family Welfare Bureau.
I see, but not totally, you don't mean to say totally independent of the Archdiocese?
Well, independent in the sense that the Melbourne response has always been seen as operating independently of the Archdiocese.
Yes. And if we can have a look at page 2, you will see that it was said to Professor Ball, your responsibilities on a day-to-day basis include, and there are a number of dot points set out. And the last one says to conduct a 6th monthly review of the CMCS unit. Do you understand what the CMCS unit references?
No, I don't.
To ascertain its clinical effectiveness, its administrative competence, and the level of client satisfaction. Now, it seems to me that that must be a reference to what became Carelink. Are you able to confirm that or express a view on that?
I don't think that occurred.
You don't think 6 monthly reviews occurred?
No.
In the modern era, so let's say in the last several years, has there been a regular process of review, or do things just get reviewed when they seem to be able to be improved?
The process is continually reviewed because there's a need for things to change and to be altered continuously.
We can go back to your statement and paragraph 29 at the foot of page 3. You'll see there you say that since 1996, in other words, its inception, Carelink has facilitated the provision and funding of counselling, medical treatment and other professional support for over 600 primary and secondary victims of sexual and other abuse. including abuse of adults by clergy, religious and lay people within the Archdiocese of Melbourne. Are you able to say, Ms. Sharkey, what proportion of those clients were victims of child sexual abuse rather than other forms of abuse covered by the Melbourne response?
Roughly speaking, 350, but I can get those accurately for you.
So a bit over half.
Yes.
The information we have is that there have been about 350 complaints upheld over the years by the independent commissioner, 307 of those being in relation to child sexual abuse up until 31 March 2014. Are you aware of those figures?
Yes. Well, I was not accurately, but I'm aware that they come through us. Many of them come through us.
Yes. But there would also be, as I understand it, many people whom you would be supporting who haven't had a particular finding made by the independent commissioner. Would that be right?
We're supporting secondary victims who are family or mainly family of primary victims. Intermittently, Peter O'Callaghan will refer people, or Jeff Gleeson will refer people who are in the process of being assessed by them and who need psychological or psychiatric care, and they will be part of our, we will be looking for appropriate services for them.
So am I to understand that the principal explanation for the difference between 357 or 350 approximately upheld complaints by the independent commissioner and the approximately 600 clients, to use that term, of Carelink would be the secondary victims?
Some of them would be adult boundary violations, which is outside of this, the Royal Commission.
But the 350 upheld complaints includes, as I understand it, adult boundary violations. 307 child sexual abuse.
Yes, okay. Well, I don't know accurately. I can get those figures for you.
Well, I'll come to the schedule, which shows some of that in a moment. But really, what I'm understanding from you is nearly half, maybe 40 or 45% of Carelink's clients are secondary victims. Would that be right?
That would be correct.
Perhaps we can look at the schedule, the cost schedule now. Your Honour, this is a schedule produced by the Archdiocese and made available to the Royal Commission, and I tender it.
Schedule will become Exhibit 16-18.
I should say at the outset, I apologise for how small it is, but we can put it on the screen and perhaps see it in bigger type. Ms. Sharkey, have you seen this schedule before?
No, I haven't.
Right, you'll see it's in really two parts. The top half dealing with what's said there to be general special issues expenditure and includes, going down the left-hand column, compensation payments for CSA claims, Melbourne, and then Melbourne response expenditure, and then there's a subtotal of total expenditure. Do you see that? And then there's a second half below that which deals with Carelink matters. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, this deals with the various years from 1996 to year to date being March 2014, from right to left. If we can go to the most right-hand column, you'll see that the total Carelink expenditure over that period is calculated as 11,151,760. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it can't be seen on the screen as it is, but that figure is made up of three figures. The first one of 2,198,837 is Carelink office employee costs. Do you see that?
Yes.
And the second one of 1,567,450 is Carelink office administration costs.
Yes.
And then the third one of 7,385,474 is Carelink medical consultation, counselling, treatment costs.
Yes.
Those costs, I take it, would be what Carelink has paid to external health service providers. Would that be right?
Yes.
And if one takes your figure of 600 clients over that period, and an average total cost of just over 11 million, that would give us an average per client of about $18,000. I don't expect you to do the arithmetic in your head, Ms. Sharkey, but you're welcome to if you're up to it. I wouldn't be.
I won't be.
And is that a figure, an approximate figure you've been aware of before today, that the average cost per...
Well, I haven't been aware of it, but it makes sense.
Makes sense to you, doesn't surprise you or
No.
as being too high or too low or anything else?
In terms of per person, it's very difficult to judge because the seriousness and the trauma that some people have suffered and the needs have been greater than others. So it obviously is an average that isn't balanced in that sense.
And then if one looks at the amount that's been spent on directly on treatment, in other words, to external health service providers, the 7,385,474, that would then average out at about $12,000 per client.
Also, that would might be an average, but it wouldn't be a true figure for some of the victims. There are some, well, all the victims are extremely traumatised and distressed and needing assistance, but there are others who need greater assistance, so that figure would be not balanced as an average. You really can't do an average figure on it.
Yes, some would be really quite low, I suppose, and others really quite high.
Yes.
But as a proportion then of what's spent on treatment, 12,000 on average, and what's spent on administration, essentially 2/3 of the costs are spent on treatment. How does that sound to you as a proportion?
That sounds totally appropriate.
Now, if one has a look at the line of total Carelink expenditure, so in other words, the line which ends with 11,151,000 and so on, and looks back from 1997 up the years, you'll see that whilst it goes up and down, ultimately it steadily increases. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if the arithmetic is correct, that arrives at an average increase of 18% per annum. That's obviously way above inflation. Do you have any comment or reaction to that?
My response to that would be that some victims that came to Carelink in 1996 are still receiving services. And so the numbers of treating people continue to increase rather than decrease.
And I think we'll come to it in a moment, but you say elsewhere that you currently have about 200 active clients.
Yes, that's correct.
So of your 600 in total over the 17 or so years, nearly a third remain active. Would that be right?
Yes, but they're not always the same people.
Yes.
You know,
People come and go.
well, they come and go, and since the Victorian inquiry, we've had 70 people approximately returned.
So given that, would you be able to say whether there's any length of time that, on average, that someone would need support from Carelink, or is that just impossible to say?
It's quite impossible to answer. We're still dealing with our number 1 and 2 client.
Now, we see the actual figures here over the years as provided to the Royal Commission. Is Carelink given a particular budget or allocation each year as to what can be spent?
I'm asked at the end of the year to provide a budget, but it's quite impossible to indicate whether or not that's going to be enough, because we have no idea how many victims are going to come forward or how many are going to return.
And has there been an occasion in which you've been told that that's enough? You can't
Never.
go beyond that.
Never.
Can't spend more this
Never.
this year.
No.
So, do I understand it then that essentially, provided you remain within the terms of reference, there isn't a limit on what you can do?
There isn't a limit, no.
No monetary limit, I should say.
In care of our clients, no.
Can we have a look at tab 57, and in particular page 14 of that tab? This you may recognize as the Carelink Counselling Services Annual Report for 2013, covering the calendar year 2013. You familiar with this document, I take it, Ms. Sharkey?
Sorry?
You're familiar with this document, I take it. And on what I have is page 14, that's 13, I think, one further down. Here you have some figures and a graphic illustration of new victims referred, and the report says that the graph indicates the number of new primary and secondary victims who received Carelink services during the reporting period and for the previous 9 years, so that's 2004 through to 2013. Now, the number of secondary victims reflected there through those years added up, if I'm not mistaken, comes to 60, and the number of primary victims comes to 175, which puts the secondary victims as approximately 25% of the total. Do you see that?
Yes.
And that, looking at the graphs, that would look about right. Now that's, over that period of 9 years, is a different proportion to the one we discussed earlier, of the 307 primary as to 600 clients in total, which is near about 45% or even a little higher. Are you able to explain that difference?
Since I'm not the graphics person, no, I can't. Except that I know that in terms of secondary victims, well, primary victims speak for themselves, but the secondary victims, there may be more than one member of each family who would come back, which would mean there could be a greater number of secondary victims than primary victims.
Well, it's not suggested in this graph that the secondary victims are captured only on a per-family basis. The way I read it is it suggested that that's the total number of secondary victims. In any event, it's not something you're in a position to explain.
No, it's not at this stage, no.
Yes. And you'll see there's an apparent sharp decrease in 2008, 2009 of primary victims in any event. Are you able to offer an explanation as to why that might be?
I have no idea. The
And
numbers just dropped.
The graph would tend to indicate increasing numbers in 2012, 2013. Are you able to say why you think that's the case?
Yes, I think it had to do with the Victorian inquiry and the Royal Commission being announced and the media publicity, etc., that occurred at that time.
Heightened public awareness, essentially.
Yes.
Yes. If we can go back to page 12 in this report. You'll see that towards the foot of the page, in respect of the year 2013, it's recorded there, and this accords with what you say in your statement, that there were 37 new clients during the year, 28 being primary clients, 9 secondary clients, and then it gives the split between males and females, and then at the foot of the page, Carelink serviced 196 active clients, and that accords, as I understand it, with what you're saying, about 200 active clients currently. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, of those primary victim clients, are you able to give a sense of when their abuse occurred relative to when they came into the Melbourne response?
We've only had 2 minors in the entire period of Carelink. 3 minors, sorry. And it's difficult to say, but the range of people coming in to us would probably, having a guess, would be, our youngest would be 38, 39.
So in respect to the minors, I take it 2 of them would be Emma and Katie Foster. Would that be right? Or do you not count Katie because there was no finding in relation to her ultimately?
No, we would be including Katie.
Okay, and then 1 other.
Yes.
And of the 200 active clients, are you able to give a sense of when they started with Carelink? How far back are we going? Or even proportionately?
They would range over the years from 1996 onwards.
You wouldn't be able to break it down any better than that?
No, because it's just, there's no pattern to the people returning, when they return.
People's situations are essentially unique.
Absolutely.
Could we take a look at tab 66? Now, this is a document which sets out information in relation to supervision, and it accords principally with what you say in your statement. You're familiar with this document, I take it?
Yes, sir.
What purpose was this prepared, this particular document?
I think it was prepared initially for the inquiry and to give an outline of the role of the supervisor.
Now, your current supervisor is Dr. Hacker, as you explained.
That's correct.
Would you explain what is the role of the supervisor?
The role of the supervisor is for me to go weekly to her room and to take new reports that have been received from Sue Brand for her to look at, the opinion particularly, and for me to discuss the care for people who have come forward and that we look appropriately for the best people. So she advises me and we work together on seeking the best outcomes for people. And sometimes that means her expertise in the medical field is very important, because we're not just looking at psychologists, we're looking at appropriate psychiatrists, where there might be other medical needs, etc.
I understand from your statement that you and Dr. Hacker might jointly take decisions on matters of treatment or referral. Would that be right?
Dr. Hacker would generally be the person to be involved with medical referrals, obviously, and finding and sourcing the right person. And she would advise me on the appropriate clinical, psychological care that the person may need.
So would I be right that the role played by the supervisor is one, if one could put it like this, a structural role within Carelink? It's not quite the same as a conventional supervisor relationship that a psychologist or psychiatrist might have?
No, it's probably broader than that. Well, it is broader.
Now, clearly, in order for that relationship to work properly and for the supervisor to be able to assist you, you need to disclose to the supervisor the details of the clients that you're dealing with.
Yes, but there's confidentiality is always a critical part of any of our work, and so I'd be discreet about naming the person. If it became a referral she needed to write to a doctor, then I would have always got a consent from the person for that to go ahead.
Obviously, the supervisor would be subject to rules of confidentiality.
Yes, absolutely.
So do I understand you correctly that in discussing the cases of individual clients, you would, for the most part, avoid identifying who they are? Is that the case?
Yes. It's not necessary in many cases for the person to be identified, and the name wouldn't mean anything to Dr. Hacker anyway. It's more about what the needs are for the client, and they're quite clear in Dr. Brand's opinion on many occasions, and from meeting with the client over time. And sometimes, well, very often, what the client is asking for.
And where it is necessary to identify the client, then you would get a release. Is that right?
Well, Yes, I would probably get a release, but there are occasions when it's more urgent than having to go back to get a release.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm just not sure that clients in entering the process of Carelink would know about the supervisor role. They'd certainly know about your role and the consulting psychiatrist role.
No, they wouldn't. They would know that I would very often I would say to them, I will be taking this matter to my supervisor to discuss what is the best for you.
Now, if we scroll down that document to the 7th paragraph, which starts in recent times, there have been, you see that paragraph, it says in recent times there have been a range of orchestrated complaints about the Carelink service and the Carelink coordinator, both by the media and the registration board. Can you explain what those are and what is meant by the word orchestrated?
Well, this would be my opinion rather than anything else, but there have been some organisations that have sought to make complaints about me and also about Carelink. So the Carelink ones would be dealt within the Carelink service, and as a psychologist, the registration board, I'm responsible to them. I don't work as a psychologist at Carelink, but people make complaints to the board.
Then in the next paragraph, it's recorded that some of these clients have sought payment for services that are outside the remit of the Archdiocese and Carelink, and as a result, these clients have become very abusive to the coordinator. Supervision has been a supportive environment where these issues have been able to be aired and managed. What are the nature of the claims for support that have been made which have been determined to be outside of Carelink?
We would get requests for people wanting to have their utilities paid for medical services that are not related to the abuse, for people wanting respite, other medical conditions that are not related.
Now, you might have heard Mr. Curtin last week saying that for the compensation panel, if a particular consequence is a consequence of the abuse, even if it's not the consequence, that's sufficient for the compensation panel. How does Carelink deal with that question of causation, the sequelae of abuse? How do you try and draw the line as to what's arising from the abuse and what isn't?
Very often that's a medical issue, and it would have been dealt with in the psychiatric assessment, and secondly with Dr. Hacker.
Now, dealing with a typical case, I understand from your statement that typically someone coming to Carelink for the first time would have an initial meeting with you. Is that right?
That's correct.
Can you explain the process of such a meeting and what it is that you try and achieve in that meeting?
At that meeting, I would introduce myself as the coordinator and spend some time explaining to the client about the next stages of the process and ask them to read about the process and to sign relevant confidentiality forms and talk to them about the sorts of things that would be discussed at the assessment with Dr. Brand, and explain very clearly to the client that they've made or we have a transcript of their complaint from Peter O'Callaghan, and that they will never have to speak either at the assessment or at any other time, including the panel, about their abuse. That what will be looked for is the consequences of the abuse and what's related to it.
Would it be right that, whilst it may be the intention not to require a client to speak again about the abuse itself, in order to speak about the consequences and why the consequences do arise from the abuse, clients would have to get very close to talking about the abuse?
Not necessarily. The client would be asked, not by me, my boundaries are very clear, so it would be with the psychiatrist. She would talk about their life, their upbringing, their education. Yes, that might be related to the abuse, but she doesn't deal with the abuse. She would deal with the person's life in general and where things had gone for them. And the only question related to the abuse would be, is there anything that you would like to add that you haven't said already?
Now, aside from immediate care, which might be needed, care and support, the next step would be the assessment, is that right?
That's right.
And what is the purpose of the assessment?
The purpose of the assessment is to look at what psychological, psychiatric or other needs may be needed for the client, and that the best report possible is made available for the panel, the compensation panel.
So it really has those two components. One is I'm not sure that this is the appropriate language, but a treatment plan or regime, and the other is an assessment for the compensation panel.
That's right.
And I understand typically in those meetings, both you and the consulting psychiatrist would be present.
Yes, and I discussed that at the initial meeting and explained that I'll be the one face that they will know at the assessment, and that my role there is not to speak at the assessment, but to be able to follow through any of the advice given by Dr. Brand. And that following that, given that Dr. Brand always alerts the client to the fact that it's a very stressful thing for the client to have to discuss their lives and a lot of the trauma that has been part of their lives and often attributed to the abuse, and that they may have some difficult days following that, and that I will be available on the phone. The phone's put through to me weekends and holidays to speak to them if necessary. And should that arise, I would speak to the person, and if they're not in counselling, refer them back to their counsellor. If it's holidays, there's no one around, refer them to their GP or to a hospital emergency.
Has consideration been given to whether it might be less confronting for clients to be interviewed only by one person for the assessment rather than two?
There has been, and Dr. Brand would prefer that there were two people there, and the following through the outcome of the report or the outcome of that meeting with Dr. Brand is immediate, rather than having to wait for her report, which might be 2 weeks or so in coming.
Because you're aware, of course, of the response, or if I might term it, criticism, that some clients in any event have raised in this regard, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to respond to that. If we can look first at the statement of AFA, which is Exhibit 16-4, on page 3, paragraph 21. You will see there what AFA said starting in the third line, on 15 April 2011, I met with Sue Brand and Susan Sharkey at Sue Brand's office. My wife came with me as a support person. I found this meeting pretty confronting. I had to again revisit Father Glennon's abuse and the impact this has had on my life. What response do you have to that, Ms. Sharkey?
I think you will find in my submission that that is a contrary statement to what he said in relation to the actual event.
What is your recollection of what happened on that occasion?
My recollection was that he was not unhappy about what had occurred and that this was something that followed afterwards, or his statement.
And then
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, had you finished your answer?
No, it's okay.
In relation to Mr. Hirschbach, at his statement, which is 16-2, page 5, paragraphs 33 and 34. You can read that there, but in particular in paragraph 34, Mr. Hirschbach says in the second line on, I found this meeting exceptionally traumatic. There were two of them and one of me, and I felt as though I was being interrogated. I found having two people speak at once to me as a victim to be extremely confronting. I felt that the power balance shifted significantly from a one-on-one conversation. What is your response, Ms. Sharkey, to that?
Well, my response would be that if Mr. Hirschbach had not wanted me there, he could have said so, because there's always an option. That Professor Ball would have explained in the beginning what it was about. So I don't have any comment to make on that statement.
Now, as I understand it, you and the consulting psychiatrist rely on the transcript of the interview with the independent commissioner for the details of the abuse itself. Is that right?
That's right.
And you will appreciate and will have heard last week, I suppose, about the difficulties that people have in disclosing and talking about the abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Has it been considered whether it might be better to get those details by interview with a professional such as a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and that then passed on to the independent commissioner as opposed to the other way around?
It's an option. Most people amazingly come away from both Mr. O'Callaghan and Mr. Gleeson, and very often it's on the same day as they come to me for the first time, and really they have had no complaints with that I've heard. They've found it difficult to speak about the abuse, which is entirely understandable.
Ms. Sharkey, if you were setting up a system which had its sole purpose as to be to determine whether or not someone had been abused and was entitled to a compensation payment and or counselling, would you suggest it be done with a senior lawyer as the decision maker or a trained counsellor?
You've left out one option, Your Honour, and that's the medical aspect of it.
Sorry?
Sorry, let me move this forward. I don't have an issue with the lawyer because it's very brief and it has to be proven anyway. In terms of sending them to a clinical psychologist, we find that the clinical psychologist's reports do not always give a medical opinion and what has been quite very serious consequences medically for a person. And so...
No, all that I'm asking is the decision-making process as to entitlement. Do you think that's best made by...
Sorry, I missed it. someone coughed.
The decision-making process as to whether or not you might be entitled to access ongoing counselling or other medical assistance, plus a compensation payment, is that decision best made by a trained counsellor or professional person in that field as opposed to a senior lawyer?
I suppose I'm quite used to the process that we've been.
I understand that, but you realise that the process that you have has the lawyer making two decisions. One is in relation to the entitlement of the victim, and the other is in relation to the future of the member of the church. You understand that? And I'm asking these questions because we have to look at the Royal Commission at the way forward. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective as a trained professional person, whether you see the decision being best made as to whether or not someone's entitled to compensation, entitled to treatment, best made by a trained professional medical or counsel, psychologist, whatever you like, as opposed to a senior lawyer without any of that training at all?
Well, given that I'm not trained in the law either, I think a psychiatrist could, who's experienced in the area of trauma and sexual abuse specifically, could come up with an outcome. But I'm not sure that the assessing psychiatrist would want to deal with the abuse, because it's just such a traumatic part of it. And when the statement is, for instance, given by Mr. O'Callaghan or Mr. Gleeson, that is finished. And unless the person wants to speak further about it at the assessment, then that's their choice. But otherwise, the professional psychiatrist psychiatrist preferably, is looking at the well-being of the person. So it is actually two different, unless the police have been involved, of course.
Thank you, Your Honour. Ms. Sharkey, you explained in your statement that after the assessment and an assessment report is prepared and finalised, that it's sent to the compensation panel, but that it's also sent to the independent commissioner. Is that right?
That's right.
For what purpose is it sent to the independent commissioner, in your understanding? By then he's already made his finding.
Well, it's my understanding that the independent commissioner puts together just all the information required for the compensation panel.
And so it goes to the independent commissioner and then from him to the compensation panel?
We send them. You're obviously not able to hear me. We send the reports to both people simultaneously at the same time.
In the documentation, it's recorded that the assessment is to be used for the compensation panel and for no other purpose. And I can take you to the documents if you want to see it, but that's what's recorded. Are you able to explain why? Why is it there's that restriction that the assessment report can only be used for the compensation panel and no other purpose?
No, that's not the case at all. If the client has a lawyer, a copy of a report would go to the lawyer. The reason we discourage clients from taking copies, and really if they really wanted one, they would be able to get one, is for their own protection. Many times they've not told anyone else about their abuse.
Ms. Sharkey, I'm not addressing so much the point as to whether the report gets given to the client or the client's lawyer, but the purpose for which the report can be used. But let me show you the documents, and then that may refresh your memory. If we look at tab 64 on the third page, the screens are frozen. I might. You'll see it there, but I'll read it out. So this is a Carelink brochure which sets out the various aspects of Carelink, and in the heading of provision of report to compensation panel, just below the middle of that page, the last paragraph in that section, do you see it? It says, reports are prepared specifically for the compensation panel and are not to be used for any other purpose without consultation. With the client's consent, a copy of the report will be forwarded to their treating therapist. And then also, if you have a look at tab 68, which is a document which is headed Protocols for External Health Service Providers Involved in the Counselling of Victims of Sexual Abuse, referred to or by Carelink. And at page 3, paragraph 12, in the second half of the paragraph, it says, the cost of any a report prepared by Carelink for compensation hearings will be borne by Carelink, and then it says these reports are prepared specifically for the compensation panel and are not to be used for any other purpose. Now, my question was, why is that? Why can these reports not be used for some other purpose?
Well, they are a Carelink report and have been funded by Carelink. But it's more the safety issue that we... that's our practice.
Because it seems that a possible reason, and I'm inviting you to comment on this, is to ensure that the assessment report is not used in any civil claim that might be brought outside of the Melbourne response process.
Well, that would be outside my boundary to make that decision.
Now, I just want to explore with you some limits to the support that Carelink offers. Firstly, with reference to time. So as I understand it, that there's no limit time-wise in relation to support for primary victims.
That's right.
So Carelink will continue to support indefinitely, provided the periodic reviews indicate that further support and treatment is required. Is that right?
That's correct.
And what is the position in relation to secondary victims?
Initially, we started off with limited sessions for secondary victims, but the case is now that we would never, ever stop anybody having counselling while it related to the abuse. And in terms of secondary victims, one of their requests is very often that they have counselling with their partner, a relationship counselling, and that's offered as well.
And that also, I take it, would be subject to periodic review and
yes,
and satisfaction that further treatment is required.
yes,
Yes. So in effect, then, primary and secondary victims are treated the same. Am I right in relation to how long they might be supported?
yes.
That's the effect of it.
Well, in terms of both, it would be until there was they had resolved their issues around the abuse.
If you have it there, Ms. Sharkey, could you look at tab 40? Do you have it? This is a letter of appointment to you from the then business manager, Mr. Excel, in 2006. So I take it was a sort of revised appointment, was it?
I have no record of it, so yes, I'd have to agree with that.
Yes. And you'll see in paragraph 1, he says that the assignment is for you to provide clinical and administrative oversight of Carelink operations. I intend that the assignment not exceed 10 hours per week, averaged out over a 3-month period. And then the sentence I want to ask you about is Mr. Excel says, however, I would like you to interpret this in the context of finalising as many cases as possible.
Yes.
Is that something that guided you trying to finalise cases?
No.
What would that mean to you to finalise
Well,
a case?
it's actually me, because Carelink was initially, as you would have heard, set up for 6 months, and it's been an ongoing process, and I've never been asked to terminate clients or in any way at all. It's always been ongoing.
And so I've addressed the question of time. Then to move on, I'd like to address the question of the limit to what Carelink provides by way of the type of support. You've mentioned psychological and psychiatric and medical. What other types of support are offered by Carelink?
Oh, at this stage, for people who are eligible, we now have a dentist in place to do assessments. We have a specialist in integrative medicine that looks at requests from people who are asking for pharmaceutical, not pharmaceutical drugs or vitamins or whatever that are not within the scope of the normal prescription drugs. We have a social worker that we use intermittently. We have an organisation called Care by Appointment for people who need extra assistance maybe during the day or need to be taken places. We have a financial advisor for people who are wishing to seek some financial help.
And I understand it also you can make a small grant of money once per annum, is that right?
We have an amount of $300 that I can use for emergency money once a year, and beyond that I need to go outside Carelink's boundaries.
And what about any circumstances in which educational support might be given or monetary support for educational purposes? We've only had 2 cases of that. We're talking about adults here or children? Well, either. You tell me what your practices are. Okay. We've had, in the case of Emma Foster, we had a request for support for education, which, as you will have read probably, the Professor and I did try to encourage as part of her care. We have another family at the moment that are seeking assistance that's being dealt with by the Catholic Education Office. So dealt with outside of Carelink? Yes, that will, yes, because we don't have no responsibility for that, yeah. And then another issue which has arisen in the cases we've been studying, notably Emma Foster's, was the question of housing or accommodation. Is that something you've had to deal with in other cases? Yes, it has, and we've assisted where we can. And I guess one of the things I've left out is that we provide medical, we provide private health benefits for clients who might need or have had previous in-house medical psychiatric care, and who have had, and the public system doesn't provide anything very much in this day and age, so we put them into private health to assist with them being able to go into a private psychiatrist and into hospitalisation if necessary. Then the third limit, as it were, on Carelink's support, which relates to the others, is the question of causation. In other words, the relationship between the abuse and the support that's being sought. And I've asked you a bit about that already. I'd like to refer you to tab 258. You may have seen this last week. This is a claim summary document by Catholic Church Insurance, in particular in relation to Mr. Hurstbush's case, but on the second page, right at the top of the page, the author, Mr. Rolls, makes a broader statement, and he says, "I believe this matter highlights a difficulty we face with the Melbourne scheme. There are very seldom independent medical reports, and we rely upon Carelink, who appear more than ready to attribute the ailments with which the claimant presents to the alleged abuse." So the insurer suggesting that you perhaps give support too readily. Would you like to comment on that paragraph, Ms. Sharkey?
Yes, CCI are not part of Carelink's responsibility at all.
But it perhaps reflects a tension here between CCI, who foot the bill or some of it at the end of the day, and what's being offered. Would you say, though, that that characterization that you readily attribute, I'll say it again, you more than ready to attribute the ailments with which claimants present to the alleged abuse, is that a fair
No, I don't
statement?
think it is a fair statement at all, because we are very careful about what we attribute to the abuse.
Now, moving on to the question of the treatment of offenders, you say in your statement that Carelink is not involved in any way with treating offenders. Is that right?
That's right.
Perhaps the answer to this is very obvious, but why is that so?
Well, we couldn't have offenders coming into Carelink and victims. It would be totally inappropriate.
Now, you're aware that at the outset of the Melbourne response scheme, when it was established in 1996, Professor Ball had been involved in treatment of offenders, and he had been involved in assessment for court purposes for offenders. You're aware of that?
Yes.
And are you aware that at some point Professor Ball became director of Encompass Australasia, which was a treatment centre for, amongst others, child sexual abuse offenders?
I didn't know he was a director, but I know he was involved.
To your mind, would that present the same difficulties? In other words, the difficulties you've identified with Carelink possibly treating offenders and therefore not doing it, are they not also present in the consulting psychiatrist being involved in these other matters in relation to the treatment of offenders?
I don't think the treatment of victims at Carelink has anything to do with the treatment of offenders.
Well, clearly, the treatment of victims at Carelink, as you say, doesn't have anything to do with the treatment of offenders, but where the consulting psychiatrist at Carelink is also involved in the treatment of offenders. Do you appreciate that, the challenge that that presents?
Well, I guess it's similar to taking on different law cases, but that would have been done in Professor Ball's private practice, nothing to do with Carelink.
And are you aware at the time of the commencement of Carelink, when you were appointed back in 1996, whether there were other suitably qualified psychiatrists who might have been appointed as consulting psychiatrists?
Well, I wouldn't have been aware of it. It wouldn't have been something that I would have been involved in.
Dealing with the question of the claim for education support for Emma Foster, perhaps we can take a look at tab 155. Now, you recognise this document, Ms. Sharkey, a memorandum from you to Mr. Carelink,
Yes.
dated 10 February 2000, and it deals with the question of education support for Emma Foster.
Yes.
Are you aware whether any education support was given to the Fosters for Emma?
I recall speaking with Mrs. Foster at length about Emma and her education, and that both Professor Ball and I agreed that assistance should be given to Emma for her education, but it was outside our boundaries to actually make that decision in the end.
And are you aware that whether a decision was made?
I'm not sure whether there was a decision made in the end. I know that we had an allocation of money at Carelink that we've just removed that we had for Emma's education. I think there were a couple of requests. There was one for her to go to a special school, and there was another one for her later to do some nursing training. And I don't know whether she got that or not.
Okay, you don't know the outcomes of
No, I
that?
don't.
Okay. And that memorandum of yours, as we've seen, is dated 10 February 2000. You're aware that that's some time after an offer had been made to Emma by the compensation panel, or rather by the Archbishop following the recommendation of the compensation panel?
I can't remember that, no.
Well, that was on 31 August 1998. The offer was made, and subsequently it was accepted by Emma Foster, although ultimately not acted on.
Okay.
Can you assist us in explaining, in your understanding, why was it that at that stage of the process you were writing to Mr. O'Callaghan about the request for education support for Emma Foster?
Look, I can't enlarge on the dates, although all I can say is that both Professor Ball and I were both on the same, considered that Emma should be getting support for her education. So it would have been regardless of what had happened at the compensation panel, because we have nothing to do with the compensation panel.
Ms. Sharkey, are you aware that Archbishop Hart earlier this year announced a review of the Melbourne response process?
Yes.
To your understanding, does that review include Carelink?
I'm not sure what it includes. We haven't been told yet.
No further questions, Your Honour.
Ms. Sharkey, before we take the morning adjournment, you started with this work in 1996. Who was it who employed you?
The Archdiocese of Melbourne.
Yes, but which person? Did someone interview you, or were you involved in discussions about what your job would be?
Yes, I was.
Who were?
I think I was initially asked by, I was a coordinator at Catholic Family Welfare in Dandenong, and I was asked, I'd actually taken an interest in the area personally, and it may have been known, I don't know, but I was asked by the Mr. Bushell, who was in charge of Catholic Family Welfare at that time, if I would take the position.
And what did you understand to be the nature of the issues that the Church was confronting at that time?
Well, my understanding was that there was the issue of sexual abuse and clergy had become a major issue in the Church, and something needed to be done.
And where had you got that understanding from?
Well, I had dealings with victims of sexual abuse working at Dandenong, and I was also following overseas literature and had travelled overseas to see what was going on because I was interested in the matter.
At the time you took up the job, did you have any discussions with clergy about the nature of the problem?
Not that I recall.
Yes, very well. We'll take the morning agenda.
All stand.